I do want to remind you to mute your microphone. So click on your little microphone icon to mute it. I don't really hear anyone right now, but just a reminder. And I think that is all. So Jeanette, if you were ready to get started, we are good.
All right, let's get this party started. So first of all, if you want to play a game with me, go ahead and go to www.kahoot.it and use the game pin 204189. And the winner of today's Kahoot kind of game show is going to get a $20 DoorDash gift card on me. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be asking questions, and hopefully you guys will be able to smash the right buttons. So let's go ahead and get started. So in the chat function, go ahead and use that chat function, and I want you to type out, what do you think when you hear the term serial killer? Just whatever comes to your mind. All right, so we've got a couple of responses, so I'm just going to go read through these. So we got a lot of Bundy, Criminal Minds. What comes to mind is psychological problems. Amber Lee said true crime shows, can't get enough of those. Danielle, I love My Favorite Murder. Beaker says A Quiet Guy. And then Maylee said sociopath, psychopath, podcast, multiple victims. And Carolyn Bell said a person who kills more like once, like Bundy or something. So I think we're all kind of on the right track, and we're going to be examining all of the, you guys are hitting it on the head. And so we're going to be examining these different parts of kind of the serial killer archetype. So to start, I want to start with, what is a serial killer? So a serial killer is a person who kills 3 or more people over the span of a month or more, with a cooling off period between murders. This is really important because there are other types of murderers, like mass murderers or spree killers, and it's that cooling off period in between offenses that really defines the serial killer, although there can be some overlap between, a spree killer and a serial killer, especially if a serial killer takes more than one victim in one night or day. So I also want to kind of touch on maybe some of the things that you haven't pointed out when you think of serial killers. Like, a lot of times we think about, mental illness, psychopathy, emotional abuse, childhood bullying, stuff like that. And we also think about, like, them being involved in petty crimes or having problems staying employed. And then there's also the question of IQ. It's often the idea that they have a lower than average IQ or they're a complete genius. And so we're going to kind of talk about those things today. But as far as the term serial killer, the term is attributed to former FBI Special Agent Robert Riesler, who used the term serial homicide in a lecture at the Police Academy in Bramshill in 1974. Wow, that would have been a long time ago. And this man is actually one of the characters on Mindhunter. And so what's generally accepted is that it needs to be 3+ period, or 3+ people over a period of 30 days, with that cooling down period in between. And that's what's kind of universally accepted when it comes to a serial killer. And this is actually Robert K. Ressler here. And so I really like this quote of him. And he talked about how there is no such thing as the person who at age 35 suddenly changes from being perfectly normal and erupts into total evil, disruptive and murderous behavior. The behaviors that are precursors to murder have been present and developing in that person's life for a long, long time since childhood. So looking at this quote, it really shows that there is an interest in understanding the psychology of serial killers and figuring out how they tick and why they do what they do. And this is how you get into, psychopathy versus sociopathy. And we'll talk a bit more about that in detail, but I kind of wanted to spotlight this quote. All right, so we're going to start with our first Kahoot question. So make sure that you've gone to kahoot.it, and we're going to start. We've got 6 brave players. All right, so true or false, serial killers are dysfunctional loners. So make sure to pick either true or false on your screen to answer this question. You have 11 seconds. There we go. So we've got 6 people saying false, 1 person saying true. That's super duper interesting. So let's kind of tackle that head on. And I would say that it's actually false. I think that the idea of the dysfunctional loner is a stereotype that kind of gets passed around, but it's actually false. There are different types of serial killers, and we'll start with this typology that comes from the FBI Crime Classification Manual, published in 1992. So you have an organized serial killer which methodically plans their crimes. They are of above average intelligence. They abduct, kill, and dispose of their victims at different locations. They have a knowledge of forensics and police procedure, but they also have interpersonal skills that enable them to develop personal and romantic relationships. So if we think of serial killers like the Green River Killer, right, Gary Ridgway, he confessed to killing 48 women over a 20-year time period. He was employed as a truck painter for 32 years. He regularly attended church, and he was also married at the time of his arrest. So this kind of goes against that stereotype of the isolated, unemployed loner. And I think we kind of have this stereotype because of the disorganized type of serial killer. So a disorganized serial killer is impulsive. They commit a crime with weapons of opportunity that are available at the scene. They are below average intelligence, and they often leave evidence at the scene of the crime. And this is the isolated, unemployed loner stereotype that applies to just the disorganized killer, not to all serial killers. So a disorganized killer, an example of that is the Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Trenton Chase. He killed 6 people in Sacramento, California. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was convinced that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. So he would drink the blood of his victims and cannibalize their remains to prevent his heart from shrinking. And he left handprints and footprints in the victim's blood at the scene of the crime. And he would only go into homes where the door was unlocked. He felt that if the door was locked, that meant he was not welcome. But you can see how that kind of jives with the disorganized serial killer, where he's leaving evidence at the scene of the crime, and he's also isolated and unemployed and kind of a loner. You also have the mixed type of serial killer. And what can happen here is that the killer can undergo a psychological transformation that can cause them to become more organized or disorganized. So if a killer discovers, a certain method of killing that is more attractive to them, they can become more organized as they find their method. But a killer can also become more disorganized as they become more cocky and think that they can't be caught. So these are some different types of serial killers. So let's move on to our next question here. Serial killers are only motivated by sex. So let's go back to Kahoot and go to our next question. So this is our scoreboard. So true or false, serial killers are only motivated by sex. Whoa, that was quick. All right, everybody said false. Really good. And you are correct. So there are different types of motivations other than sex. And so these are the 4 main ones. And there are kind of subgroupings within these. So you have a power and control serial killer, and that's a sociopath that is experiencing sexual gratification from the domination and humiliation of their victims. A visionary serial killer is psychotic most of the time, and they are compelled by voices or visions. This type of killer you're going to recognize as Son of Sam or David Berkowitz. So David Berkowitz committed, he murdered 6 people and he injured another 10 before being caught. And he said that a demon had possessed his neighbor's dog and the demon demanded the blood of young women. And he said that's why he killed. Going back to power and control, Ted Bundy was a power control killer who would kidnap, stalk his victims. And interestingly, he actually worked at a suicide hotline with Anne Rule, and she wrote about that experience in her book, Stranger Beside Me. You also have a mission killer, which is not psychotic, but they do feel a need or a duty to rid the world of usually sex workers or people of color. And a killer like that is Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a racist who attacked and killed several interracial couples during the 1970s and 80s. He's also the one responsible for paralyzing Larry Flynt because Larry had released a spread of an interracial couple in Hustler magazine. You also have hedonistic serial killers, which receive pleasure from acts of violence. And there are 3 subgroupings within this. So you have a lust killer that enjoys sex, a thrill killer that enjoys pain and torture, and then comfort killers that kill for material gain. So these are kind of the 4 types of motivations. So we have another question. So what type of killer was BTK? Based on the groupings that we had before, what type of killer was BTK? BTK was the bind, torture, kill serial killer, Dennis Rader, who killed 10 victims in and around Wichita, Kansas. So what type of killer was he based on the types of killers I just talked about? So power and control, visionary, mission, or hedonistic? Seven. Power and control, really good. Some people got hedonistic. I would say BTK was more power and control. He really reveled in having complete control over his victims and was less hedonistic. A hedonistic killer is more like Jeffrey Dahmer, where you're killing for lust and it's not as methodical. But as you can see, there can be a lot of overlap between these categories. Like we have these categories and everything, but a killer can fall into several different categories at the same time. All right, so I want to talk about the motivation of US serial killers. So we talked about how serial killers aren't motivated just by sex. And this is this is actually motives of serial killers, period. So in the US, most are motivated by thrill, lust, power, those hedonistic urges. And then the second most reason for these killers to kill is financial gain. After that, we have anger, combination of motives, criminal enterprise, kind of gang activity, avoiding arrest, cult, and then goes all the way down to attention. So this gives you an idea of a lot of the different motives that motivate serial killers. It's not just one thing. All right, we have another question. So serial killers are all white males. Let's move on. So let's see what we have on the leaderboard. We have Mei Lee is killing it. So true or false, serial killers are white males? Wow, yes, a resounding false. So let's update the leaderboard. Mei Lee is still pulling it ahead. So let's go ahead and look at kind of race distribution. So we have this kind of stereotype that killers are white males, and it's a common misconception, especially in the media, which tends to kind of overplay the stereotypes of white serial killers that stalk their victims, and they become these fascinating popular icons. But as you can see here, so this is serial murders by race from 1900 to 2015, and I got these from the Radford University FGCU serial killer database. White serial murderers account for a large portion, but they are by no means the only, right? So we have Black serial killers clocking in at 859, Hispanic is 148, Asian 160, and that little sliver up there is other, and that was just 2. And so it was too small even to put. But this is kind of, you know, kind of dispels that notion that serial killers are all white males. And it's interesting how we kind of create this narrative of the genius white serial killer, and it kind of supports this narrative of white supremacy that these killers are able to get away with their crimes. Like, take for instance Ted Bundy. I recently watched the Netflix series that's trying to portray him as an evil genius, but when I watch it, I'm like, no, really, he was a white man with white privilege, and that's why he was able to get away with what he did. He fit in, and so he didn't look out of place. And also, you know, his guards gave him the benefit of the doubt, and I don't think they would have done that with a person of color. Like when he was left in the law library uncuffed and he was able to actually escape by jumping out of a window, I don't think that would be the case with a killer of color. And to talk about serial killers of color, you have like Derek Todd Lee, who was an African American and killed at least 6 women in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And then Carl Eugene Watts was an African American who killed 5 victims in Michigan and fled the state to avoid detection. So this is kind of we're taking down that white serial killer monolith and kind of examining, like, why is that the most popular vision of a serial killer that we have in our culture? All right, so the problem with the profile. So you have probably seen 100, you know, true crime shows, documentaries, podcasts, and what you hear every single time when someone is coming to give a profile of the killer, they say white, male, mid to late 20s, who, you know, doesn't have a job or something like that. But there's a problem with that demographic. So this is US serial killer demographics by decade from 1990 to 2016. So if we plug in male, the characteristic male, we're going to get a lot. So that's, you know, 90% of all the decades, and it's 93% of everything, right? And then when you put in white, that's still a very large portion, right? It's like 52%. Mid to late 20s, we're getting a little smaller, right? So it's 26%. If you put white male, it's 45%. And then a white male in their mid to late 20s, it's actually a very small percentage. So individually, these things may be, you know, a bigger part of the picture, but if you put them all together, you kind of restrict it down to a very kind of diminutive stereotype that doesn't tell the whole pictures. And then James Jackson says it's interesting of who does the profiling as well. And Danielle, I love that. She said, yes, that's right. God dang privilege, and bless Zac Efron for attempting to recreate them. I actually think Zac Efron was an inspired choice because he is that kind of all-American white boy. And I haven't seen it, but I would be interested in how they played with white privilege in that version of the Bundy story. All right, so like I said, this is the problem with the profile. Let's also talk about gender. All right, so this is US serial killers by gender and decade. As you can see, men have a much more, you know, a higher trajectory than women, but women are still killing here, as we can see with serial killer. I want to say before we start, gender is a spectrum. So we're going to be talking about men and women, but that's because the parameters that are used to examine serial killers don't take into account you know, all the genders in between, right? You know, they're not thinking about non-binary, gender fluid, all of that. And so, but before we do that, I have another question for you. So female serial killers are more likely to, and let's go to that next question. Oh, oops, sorry guys, I have another question here. It's actually, serial killers are insane or evil geniuses? False. And you guys are right, and we'll get to that in just a minute. I think I have my questions out of order. So, oh, Amberly has overtaken Maylee in the... All right, so let's answer this question now. So female serial killers are more likely to target a stranger, stalk their victim, be related to the victim, or kill for sexual gratification. Be related to the victim. And you guys are actually, God, you guys are killing it today. All right, so yes, female serial killers are more likely to be related to their victim. But I kind of want to talk about, does gender matter when it comes to how men and women kill? Yes and no. All right. Julie's like, LOL, killing it. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that to be a pun. So does gender matter? So yes and no. All right. So I would say gender doesn't matter in terms of there is not an inherent way that women kill versus men, but there is a difference in the way we socialize men and women. So we have very gendered and sexist assumptions of how men and women kill serially. Okay. So I would say, so for example, male serial killers are often portrayed as being compelled to kill, right? And they have this inability to give in, to resist their twisted sexual desires. And this kind of echoes our misogynistic belief in our own culture that men aren't responsible for acting on their sexual urges. It's the object of their sexual desire that's at fault. Whereas women, female serial killers, are portrayed as being more pragmatic, and they're killing for money or sympathy or status instead of lust. But that's not true. And there's an example of the angel of death, Jan Toppen, was a nurse who killed 31 people by poisoning them. And she admitted during her trial that she was aroused by death. And she would lie in bed with her victims after dosing them with poison, caressing and holding them close to her body as they died. So I would say, you know, even though these are the characteristics of male and female serial killers, there are definitely outliers. And our assumptions about how men or women kill can actually lead law enforcement to overlook suspects. So I'm thinking of serial killer and sex worker Eileen Wuornos, who killed 7 men, and she actually went undetected for a long time because she killed in a traditionally male, more violent way by shooting her victims. So kind of things to keep in mind. And then I want to share this video with you because it's hilarious.
What do you got for me, Davies?
Triple homicide. The victim's wounds perfectly match what we saw last month at Columbus. We got a serial killer on our hands.
Whoever did this is one sick fuck who wanted to see his victims tortured. When we find this asshole, I'm gonna make sure he pays.
She pays.
What are you saying, Davies?
She pays, Detective. We have strong evidence to suggest the killer is a woman.
Really?
Surveillance footage clearly shows a female figure.
Shit.
Yeah. Now, we have a lot of work to do. Do you think maybe we should head
This
back?
is the goddamn coolest lady in the world.
I'm sorry, Detective?
I know. It's terrible what she did, but it's just kind of like, damn. You go, girl.
What?
Serial killing is such a male-dominated field. What a serious blow to that glass ceiling.
I don't think that that's what we should be focusing on now.
I know. What she did is unforgivable. She must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
Why are you smiling, Detective?
Sorry, it's just I've been waiting my whole career for this. This is very inspiring for little girls everywhere.
A serial killer is not a good role model for children.
No, of course not. She's a psychopath. She needs to be locked up.
Yes, definitely.
Can you imagine the movie they're gonna make about her one day? Oh my God, I hope they get Jennifer Lawrence to play me.
15 totally innocent men died. Do you have no sympathy for the victims if they're men?
Of course I do. God, I'm not gonna be able to sleep until she's caught. But, just like, come on, totally innocent? Yeah, right.
What does that mean?
I just mean they're men. You know, how innocent are they?
Detective!
Never mind. Look, you're right. This is a horrific crime. It's indefensible. Not a single one of those men deserve this.
Yes, Now we have work to do.
But this is great.
What?
Not as an act, but for women. I mean, we're really breaking through barriers right now.
Detective!
I'm a disturbed person. We need to find this monster as quickly as possible. But how many female serial killers can you name? Because I can only name like 2.
Do I need to remind you that she hung her victims up from the ceiling with their intestines?
And that is the most villainous thing I have ever heard in my entire life. But wow. I mean, can you imagine the upper body strength she has to lift up these men?
We have a job to do. You are enjoying this way too much.
Look, I fully grasp how appalling she is, but damn it, Davies. I'd be lying if I said I didn't dream of a world where both men and women were constantly afraid, and not just women.
Detective, we have her on the line.
You better talk to us.
Wait, a woman lead detective?
Yeah. I'm so glad you noticed.
You go, girl.
So that kind of
Hi, it's Katie Mirabert.
gets to the point of what we've been discussing, right? Like in terms of gender and how women kill and men kill, it can be different. And I've read a lot of stuff about this, but it has a lot to do with like our gendered expectations of our very strict gender roles in our society. So I was reading about how like women are a lot less likely to stalk their victims because they don't want to be alone and stalking somebody alone out there because they could become the victims of a crime themselves. And so those are kind of some things to keep in mind. So in short, gender matters, but also it doesn't. And there are serial killers who can kind of break those conventions. So this is our next question, but you guys already answered it. So serial killers are either insane or evil geniuses, but you hit it right on the head. Most of you guys said false. And so to the evil genius part, if we look at IQs of serial killers, the average IQ of serial killers is 94. Now, the average score that you can get on a IQ test is 100, and most people fall within the 85 to 114 range. And any score over 140 is considered a very high IQ, and 160 is considered genius. So if we're looking at IQs of US serial killers, the average is a 94, which fits really within that normal range. A median IQ is going to give you a much better idea, and it's 86, so that's well within the normal range. Also, if we look at serial killer IQ by type, there's not much difference between an organized serial killer and a disorganized serial killer. And it looks like a mixed serial killer is generally going to have a higher IQ, which makes more sense because it's more work and more thinking. But this kind of dispels the idea that serial killers are evil geniuses. They're just like you and I, and they're not especially smarter or less smart than the normal population. All right. Are serial killers mentally ill? So I would say no. So mentally ill people are actually more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators, and less than 4% of criminal offenders are actually found to be legally insane. I think we throw around the word crazy whenever we hear about a story of a serial killer who's done something really horrible, really heinous and terrible. But I think that's oversimplifying it. And there are, sociological and psychological causes for this kind of behavior. And I think to just say that that person is crazy, it kind of stigmatizes mental illness, and it also just oversimplifies it. And we have to look at the kind of psychological factors that are at play and the sociological factors that are at play. So, looking at nature versus nurture. And researchers do tend to focus on the psychological or sociological explanations of serial killing. And, a number of psychopathy related disorders have been attached to serial killers. All right, so I want to look at the McDonald triad. So my serial killer fans out here will be familiar with this. So this is also known as the triad of sociopathy or the homicidal triad. So it's these 3 factors that have been suggested that a combination of these would be precursors to violent crime and serial killing. So enuresis is bedwetting, fire setting, and animal cruelty. And it was first proposed in 1963 And even though it's kind of been, it's influential and widely taught, even though subsequent research has generally invalidated this line of thinking, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who have one or two of these things and they never turned out to be a serial killer. Danielle says, what about a head injury? Danielle, are you playing serial killer bingo over there? Yes, there are a lot of head injuries. I'm not going to cover that so much, but that more has to do with kind of sociopathy and psychopathy, which I'm going to get into next. Okay, so psychopathy. So psychopathy comes from the German word psychopastisch and was conceived by this German psychiatrist over here. And it was used in a criminal context during 1883 murder trial where a Russian psychiatrist testified that the defendant was a psychopath and she was found not guilty because of that. This led to a lot of rage in the newspapers, and people argued that psychopaths should be immediately hanged and done away with. So in the early 20th century, what happens is we then get this term constitutional psychopathic inferiority, okay, which is just adding more onto it. And it's used to describe a wide range of antisocial and dysfunctional behaviors, including homosexuality back then, which is not true today. The word constitutional suggested that the issue was inherent to the genetics of the person. So they were kind of making a connection between being a psychopath with some kind of social part of it, and it was influenced by genetics, but also by the environment. So looking at psychopathy versus sociopathy, psychopathy was replaced by sociopathy for a time, and they were often used interchangeably. So you'll often hear like people say, "Oh, he's a psychopath" or "he's a sociopath." So sociopathy is more antisocial behaviors that were the product of an environment, and psychopathy evoked a deeper genetic or developmental cause. And it's kind of moot at this point because both of these traits and behaviors are covered by the diagnostic label antisocial personality disorder. But kind of giving you a versus, so psychopath versus sociopath. So a psychopath has lack of guilt, remorse, there's lack of empathy, lack of any deep emotional attachments, narcissism, a superficial charm, a dishonesty, manipulativeness, and reckless risk-taking, where on the sociopath side, we have repeated violations of the law, pervasive lying and deception, physical aggressiveness, reckless disregard for safety of self or others, irresponsibility in work and family environments, and lack of remorse. So that leads me to my next question, which is, which of the following killers is a psychopath? So let's go back to Kahoot. Let's take a look at our leaderboard. Oh, May's back on top. Amber, you got to get it. So which of the following killers is a psychopath? David Berkowitz, Joseph Paul Franklin, Richard Chase, or Ted Bundy? Remember, we talked about superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy. You got it, Ted Bundy. For those of you who are going for Berkowitz, I kind of put him in there because he's more like a visionary killer, and he had definitely a lack of empathy, but he did not have quite that superficial charm, and he fell more into like the loner kind of category. So I kind of threw that in there to give you a curveball. All right, so I do want to talk about the frequency of serial killers by decades. So who said it? Bundy made social connections. How dare, my brain is mad. That's what Danielle says. Yes, I am too. But yeah, he's able to make those superficial connections and maintain romantic relationships. And that's kind of the hallmark of a psychopath. Serial killer frequency by decade of first kill. So you can see here we have, this is US and international. So the red line is US and the yellow is international, and then total is the gray line. We can see here that kind of serial killers explode in the 80s and 90s, and then they've been steadily on the decline ever since then. And the reason for that is just modern life. Okay, so they're on the decline because technology and advances in forensic make it much more difficult for them to hide. I really love, I don't know if you guys have read I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. If you haven't, it's a really good book. It was a really great read. I actually read it before they caught the Golden State Killer, and it was utterly terrifying and very well written. And she writes a letter to an old man in the book, and it addresses it to the Golden State Killer, which he had not been captured yet. he had committed 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and 100 burglaries in California in between 1973 and 1986. And because he stopped in 86. And she writes, I think you bailed when the world began to change. You cut out when you looked over your shoulder and saw your opponents gaining on you. So that's probably the reason why we have fewer serial killers. Also, people have suggested that the reason we have fewer serial killers is because there's more access to mass murder because of the easy access of guns. So, all right, so our last question for today is, how likely are you to be killed by a serial killer? This is your last chance to overtake Mei Lee. So how likely are you to be killed by a serial killer, guys? 0.00039. Once again, you guys are on it. You are completely correct. So this is your percentage. It's 0.00039%. That's how likely you are to be killed by a serial killer. You're more likely to die in a plane crash or be attacked by a shark. And that kind of leads us to the end of the presentation. So I have here, I promised you I was going to talk about how to spot a serial killer. But you can't really spot one. They're really hard to spot because even the ones that have psychopathic and sociopathic behaviors, they're really good at hiding it. And you can't always know which precursors are going to develop into somebody, becoming a violent serial killer later. But there are some things you can do. So you can believe victims of violence and sexual assault, and you can also advocate for vulnerable populations like sex workers, homeless people, people with mental illnesses or disabilities, women, queer and transgender people, and indigenous people and people of color. And you can also work to dismantle a culture of patriarchy and white supremacy that has allowed in the past serial killers to murder with impunity, and also kind of leads us to glorify them as these kind of icons. So these are my sources. And you can find me on the internet at Monster Scholar on Twitter and YouTube, and I'll be posting a video of this webinar later this week. So thank you so much. That's all I have. I'll throw it back to our moderator.
Hello, everyone again. Thank you so much, Jeanette. That was really fascinating and terrifying at parts, but
yes,
I'm glad that there's such a low chance of getting killed by a serial killer. I didn't know it was that low. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but my husband watches all these true crime shows, so it was interesting to hear.
Yeah, it's funny because like it's inversely proportional. So serial killers, like the incidence of them have actually been going down, but our interest in them has exploded.
Yes, there have recently been a lot of books I've seen come out that have dealt with like our interest in murder and crime, and specifically there's one about girls being murdered. Just our interest in that in both media and books and true crime and all that.
I wanna point out what Mei Lee says. Mei Lee said, "Who won?" And Sally said, "We all won because we weren't killed by a serial killer." But let's go ahead and show who won. Oh, Tori's coming in third place. Beaker is second. And who's number one? Amity!